very good evening and welcome to this special discussion with the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. John William ASHE. A very good evening, sir, and welcome to a special discussion right here on Newsfirst.
Good evening.
Starting off, sir, tell us, what is the purpose of your visit to Sri Lanka?
Very simply, to participate in the World Youth Conference, which Sri Lanka is hosting.
Now, you are the president of the 68th sessions of the United Nations General Assembly. You have a background of a bioengineer, which is quite interesting, now a diplomatic posting. You have been involved in climate change issues as well over the last few years from the year 2004. What are you expecting to achieve, sir, during your tenure in office?
Well, for the benefit of your viewers, the theme of the 68th session is the post-2015 development agenda setting the stage. And I hope that at the conclusion of my term of office in mid-September of this year, we would have done exactly that. That is, set the stage for the post-2015 development agenda.
Mr. President, is 1 year enough as a president to make a change at the United Nations General Assembly?
Yes, it should only be 1 year. That is my personal view. And how effective a president is entirely dependent on the membership of the UN General Assembly. So whether it's a term for a year or 5 years, you're still at the mercy of the member states of the United Nations.
What do you foresee as your biggest challenges in the next few months?
To complete the work that I started, namely to set the stage for the post-2015 development agenda.
Now, many nations, Mr. President, have called for reforms at the United Nations General Assembly. What are your thoughts on eventual efforts to make the United Nations General Assembly more relevant and revitalized?
Well, reform is a multifaceted exercise. I suppose the aspect of reform that has caught the public's imagination has to do with the Security Council, but that is not the only organ within the United Nations system. There is a General Assembly itself, where you have all 193 member states, and that there's an ongoing exercise to revitalize the General Assembly.
Mr. President, are you pressing for reforms at the UNGA?
It is part of the initiatives that I announced on the day I was elected. So the short answer is yes, I am.
Mr. President, during my interview with the Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, a few years ago, he said that he too is pressing for reforms at the United Nations General Assembly and even the United Nations Security Council. However, nothing has been done over the last 2 years since I did this interview with the UN Secretary General. What is the reason behind this? What is the deadlock to revitalize and make the UNGA more relevant? What is the issue?
Well, as I said, there are two main organs of the United Nations, the General Assembly and the Security Council. On the latter, I think it would be accurate to say that reform has been lacking, but on the former, I would beg to disagree.
Mr. President, China, Russia, France, UK and the United States, we're talking about the Security Council. They're the 5 vetoes in the UN Security Council. Do you in any way believe that these 5 nations are controlling the United Nations?
If they control the United Nations, let me put it another way. They certainly do have a big say in what happens within the Security Council. They're known as the P5, and yes, they each have a veto.
So what do you mean by that? Are they controlling, yes or no? What is your opinion, personal opinion? You were the ambassador since 2004 to your countries, Antigua and Barbuda, since 2004. You know how the system works. So you've been talking to these representatives, you've been representing the UN General Assembly for some time now. Your opinion, what is your opinion? Do you think that the 5 vetoes are controlling the United Nations?
Well, we do need to separate the two organs. In the case of the Security Council, having a veto is, of course, the ultimate goal of any member state who is a member of the Security Council. And countries that do possess that certainly have an overwhelming say on how matters are ultimately resolved within the Security Council. However, it is different within the General Assembly.
Must this situation change, Mr. President?
Well, I think, and this is the prevailing view, that the current composition of the Security Council does not reflect present-day realities. So, yes, it is not my view, it is the view of the majority of the member states that they ought to be changed within the Security Council.
Can the United Nations General Assembly do anything to impose pressure to reform the UN Security Council? Can that be done?
The short answer is yes, and there has been an exercise that has been that we've been undergoing for quite some time, over the last 20 years or so. Now, so there's no shortage of effort. Where there's a shortage is a consensus view on how it should be done.
As the President of the United Nations General Assembly, what are your thoughts on Sri Lanka's human rights record?
Well, Sri Lanka, like any other member state of the United Nations, has its own set of challenges on all fronts, including on human rights. As President Generally, if I do have a personal view, the answer is no. Neither do I have one on any other country's view. That is not the role of the President of the General Assembly.
What is your view overall as the President of the GA? What are your thoughts on the human rights record in Sri Lanka?
Well, as I said, I don't have a personal view, either as the President of the General Assembly or as an individual. What I do care about, though, is that human rights should be observed, irrespective of the country.
Mr. President, as you are well aware, a resolution was passed this March calling for an international investigation into the last stages of the war here in Sri Lanka. Now, you were in fact present at the opening session of the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions, which is the 25th session. Now, Sri Lanka has said that they will not cooperate, Mr. President. Failing to adhere to this particular resolution question, which was adopted at the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions, how will this affect Sri Lanka in the long run?
Well, that is a question I don't think that I could answer, nor could any President of the General Assembly. Ultimately, as is the case with any resolution adopted by any organ of the UN, it is within the purview of the member state to adhere fully to it as a member of the United Nations community. We certainly hope within the General Assembly that for every decision that we adopt, member states do implement them.
Failing to adhere to this resolution in question, can the General Assembly, consisting of 193 member states, impose pressure in a situation like this, Mr. President? Is that possible?
Well, the role of the Assembly is not to impose pressure. Ultimately, the report of the Human Rights Council will be considered within the appropriate committee of the General Assembly, the third committee, and a decision will be taken thereon. As I said before, decisions not taken within Article 7 of the Security Council of the United Nations Charter do not carry legal weight, so they couldn't legally make Sri Lanka comply with whatever the recommendations are. One would hope, though, as is true for any General Assembly decision, that the country in question will implement the recommendations of the decisions taken.
You're here in Sri Lanka now, Mr. President. I'm well aware that you cannot make a complete assessment of the situation in Sri Lanka in a day or two. You're leaving this evening as well. You arrived in Sri Lanka on Monday. You're leaving tonight. But what are your thoughts on the youth conference that was held here in Sri Lanka? How do you view Sri Lanka as a whole?
Well, on the conference itself, I think it was a good initiative, and I thank Sri Lanka for offering to host it, and certainly from my own personal observations that I saw in the few hours that I spent at the conference, to certainly make a success of it. I think it's a worthy initiative, and we hope that the outcome of the conference would be made available for the consideration of the international community.
Mr. President, let me drag your attention to the September sessions, which was the 68th sessions of the United Nations General Assembly. The Sri Lankan President, addressing the sessions, said, "It is disturbing to observe the growing trend in the international arena of interference by some in the internal matters of developing countries in the guise of security and guardians of human rights. Therefore, we continue to witness agitations the world over leading to violence and forcing political change accompanied by turmoil. Now, you were the president of the 68th sessions of the United Nations General Assembly. What are your thoughts on this statement made by the president of Sri Lanka?
Well, I think the president is within his right to reflect his views on what he considered to be, I think the word you use, interference by others. Whether I have a personal opinion on that or not, it's clearly that cannot be the case. It's not for me to have personal views on the utterances of heads of state and government at a General Assembly debate session.
So do you think there's interference by some states into internal affairs of other nations?
Well, the world we live in is not perfect, and there are those who are in a position, for whatever reason, whether it's something that they've taken on upon themselves or not, to make pronouncements about the affairs of other countries. That has always been so, and that will always be so. And I don't think any president of the General Assembly could change that.
The Sri Lankan president also said, Mr. President, that visible progress has been made and there is disproportionate emphasis on Sri Lanka. What are your views? Do you agree or disagree? Sri Lanka is now in the center of attention as far as the United Nations Human Rights Council sessions are concerned. We see there is a lot of human rights violations in other states like Afghanistan, in Pakistan. There are drone attacks taking place. In Afghanistan, thousands of people were killed. Why this emphasis on Sri Lanka alone at this point of time? What is the reason?
Well, the president is within his right to make an assessment based on the information available to him, which is certainly not available to me. If he is of the view that there is excessive attention being paid to Sri Lanka for whatever reason, and he believes that that ought not to be the case, then he is within his right to say so.
Do you see a polarization of power in world politics today?
We do live in a time when there are a number of developments, and one could point to Syria, Ukraine, Central African Republic, that is sort of shedding a light on international politics, which is not exactly favorable. But I'm sure you could compare this with any previous era and draw the same conclusions.
Now, there seems to be an imbalance in most countries, Mr. President, affecting the actions of certain countries. Let's take the United States for an example. The actions of the United States have affected more or less a lot of Middle Eastern countries at present. And the questionable human rights record issues are dominating world politics today. Can the UNGA do anything about this situation? We're talking about polarization of power. You just agreed to my question before. Can the UNGA do anything about this? And what steps have you taken, Mr. President, during the last few months as the president of the GA to change this notion, to change the situation?
Well, if your question is, can the General Assembly prevent any country from focusing on another country's human rights, the short answer is no. As I said, the General Assembly cannot make a member state do anything, including not focusing on human rights. That is left to the sovereign right, and I hope that you will agree with this, for the country concerned, including the United States.
Mr. President, what must the United Nations General Assembly do to listen to other countries, to listen to the developing world? What must it do?
Well, for one thing, the concerns of the developing countries must be made central to the work of the United Nations. I think to some extent that's what we are doing now in focusing on the post-2015 development agenda. Developing countries have always highlighted that the development of their economies is, if not the primary concern, a key concern. And I hope that at the conclusion of my particular initiative in September, we would have set the stage for that to be a key concern of the UN.
You have been in office for nearly 8 months now, Mr. President. What are your observations about the UNGA?
Well, we are well on our way with the exercise that I called for on the day I was elected, namely to set the stage for the post-2015 development agenda. Ultimately, it would depend on my successors to ensure that we do actually get there by September 2015.
Where is reform needed? The United Nations General Assembly or the United Nations Security Council?
As an organization, the UN needs to be constantly involved in reform. If it doesn't, it will wither on the vine and die. The General Assembly needs to be revitalized. That is an ongoing exercise. The Secretariat needs to modernize, and the Security Council does need to reform.
My final question to you is, Mr. President, hopefully when we sit here in 12 months, and I ask you what you can point to as your achievements as General Assembly President, what do you hope to be able to say?
Well, what I hope member states would say, since in 12 months I don't know where I'd be, I'd love to be back in Sri Lanka, is that we did set the stage for the post-2015 development agenda.
Mr. President, thank you very much for joining us right here on Newsfirst. Pleasure to have you on board today.
ඇන්ටිගුවා හා බාබඩෝසි ශාන්ත ජෝන් නුවර උපන් ජෝන් W. ඇෂ් මහතා ඇමරිකාවේ පෙන්සිල්වේනියා විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයේ ජීව ඉංජිනේරුවේදය පිළිබඳ ආචාර්ය උපාධිය ලැබුවේ. 1987 වසරේදී රට විදේශ සේවාවට එක් වූ ඇෂ් මහතාගේ ගෝලීය රාජ්‍යතාන්ත්‍රික මෙහෙවර අගයමින් 2007 වසරේදී බ්‍රිතාන්‍යයේ දෙවන එලිසබෙත් මහරජින නම්බු නාමයක්ද පිරිනමා තිබෙනවා. 1995-2004 කාලය තුල එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ ඇන්ටිගුවා හා බාබඩෝස් රාජ්‍යයේ නේවාසික නියෝජිතයා ලෙස කටයුතු කළ ඇෂ් මහතා 2005 වසරේදී පැවති තිරසර සංවර්ධන කොමිසමේ 13 වන සැසිවාරයේදී සභාපතිත්වයේ සෙලුවා. අනතුරුව එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ විවිධ නියෝජිත ආයතනවල හා විශේෂ දූත මණ්ඩල මෙහෙයුම්වල ප්‍රධානත්වයේ ඉසුළු ඔහු මහා මණ්ඩලයේ සභාපති ධූරයට පත්වන්නේ එහි 8 වන සැසිවාරයේ පැවති 2013 වසරේ ජූනි 13 වෙනිදායි. මෙම දුරේ දරන අතරතුර ඔහු එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ හා ලෝක වෙළඳ සංවිධානයේ ඇන්ටිගුවා හා බාබඩෝස් රාජ්‍යයේ නිත්‍ය නියෝජිත තනතුරුවලද කටයුතු කරමින් සිටිනවා. රටවල් 150කට අධික සංඛ්‍යාවක තරුණ නියෝජිතයින් ලෝක තරුණ සමුළුවට එක්ව සිටියා. ලෝපුරා රටවල් ගණනාවක තරුණ කටයුතු අමාත්‍යවරුන්ද මේ අවස්ථාවට එක්ව සිටියා. සමාරම්භක උත්සවයට එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ මහලේකම්වරයාගේ තරුණ කටයුතු පිළිබඳ නියෝජිතවරයා මෙන්ම එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ මහා මණ්ඩල සභාපතිවරයාද එක් වුණා.
Truly, this is about you.
ඇත්තෙන්ම මෙය ඔබ වෙනුවෙන් වූ ඉසව්වක්. මේ ඔබේ ලෝකයයි. ඔබ සහ ඔබේ දරුවන් එහි උරුමකරුවන් වෙනවා. ඉතින් ඔබ කුමක් කළත් ඔබ මීට කලින් එවැනි දෙයක් කර නැත්නම් ඊට මැදිහත් විය යුතුයි. අපි කතා කරන්නේ අනාගතය ගැන. මා දැකපු අනාගතයේ උරුමකරුවන් ඔබයි. ඒ අනාගතය ඔබට හිමි එකක්. එය සුරක්ෂිත කිරීම සඳහා ඔබ ඔබේ උපරිමය කළ යුතුයි. ඉතින් ඔබගේ හඬට ඇහුම්කන් දීම අවශ්‍යයි. අපි අපේ ඉලක්ක ජය ගැනීමට වඩාත් උපාය මාර්ගික විය යුතුව තිබෙනවා. එම ඉලක්කවල අර්ථාන්විතභාවය තහවුරු කිරීමට ඒවා ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්නේ කොහොමද කියන එක අපි තහවුරු කළ යුතුයි. අපි අත්කර ගන්නා වූ ප්‍රගතිය කෙබඳුද කියන එක පරීක්ෂා කිරීමේ ක්‍රමවේද ඇති කිරීමත් ඉතා වැදගත්.
Have ways in which we can check what progress we are making.
සමාරම්භක උත්සවයේදී ලෝක තරුණ සමුළුවේ නිල තේමා ගීතයද ඉදිරිපත් කෙරුණා. අනතුරුව අදහස් දැක්වූ ජනාධිපති මහින්ද රාජපක්ෂ මහතා.
The primary responsibility to ensure youth participation in development.
සංවර්ධනයේ තරුණ සහභාගීත්වය සහතික කිරීමේ මූලික වගකීම රාජ්‍ය සතු වනවා. මෙම වෑයම අර්ථවත් හා සාර්ථක කර ගැනීම සඳහා නායකින් හා ප්‍රතිපත්ති සම්පාදකයින් වෙත වන අභියෝග ගණනාවක් පිළිබඳව සලකා බැලිය යුතුයි. ඕනෑම සමාජ ක්‍රියාදාමයක තරුණ සහභාගීත්වය පිළිබඳව ඔබ විමසූ විට සාම්ප්‍රදායික ප්‍රතිපත්ති සම්පාදකයන්ගේ කෝණයෙන් බොහෝ විට විමසනු ලබන්නේ එවන් කාලයක් සඳහා හැකියාව, දැනුම, අත්දැකීම්, නායකත්වය හා සම්පත් ඔවුන් සතුව ඇද්ද යන්නයි. යැපෙන්නන් හෝ ප්‍රතිලාභීන් මිස වඩාත් යහපත් ප්‍රතිඵල සඳහා දායක විය හැකි ක්‍රියාශීලී හවුල්කරුවන් ලෙස තරුණීන් නොසලකා හැර තිබෙනවා. අපගේ සුවිශේෂී තරුණ ජනගහන අවශ්‍යතා හා අභිලාෂයන්ට ශ්‍රී ලංකාව විශේෂ අවධානයක් යොමු කර තිබෙනවා. 1971 දී හා 1989 දී හටගත් තරුණ කැරලි දෙකක අත්දැකීම් සහිත අප සාහසික අසම්තෘප්තිය ඇති කරන හේතු පිළිබඳව විමසිලිමත්. විශේෂයෙන් ප්‍රතිපත්ති සම්පාදනයේදී හා ක්‍රියාත්මක කිරීමේදී තරුණීන් ක්‍රියාශීලී සහභාගීකරුවන් වූ විට ආර්ථික හා සමාජ සංවර්ධනයේ වඩාත් සාර්ථක වන බව ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ පිළිගැනීමයි. ඔබ සැමගෙන් ලෝකයේ නියෝජනය කරන තරුණ පිරිසකගෙන් ඔබගේ රට පූජනීය ලෙස සලකන ලෙසට මම ඉල්ලා සිටිනවා. එය ඔබගේ කිසිදු වෙනත් උවමනාවකට දෙවැනි විය යුතු නැහැ. එමෙන්ම එය කුමන ආකාරයේ ප්‍රතිලාභයක් වෙනුවෙන් හෝ කැප කළ නොහැකි. රට වෙනුවෙන් වන ඔබගේ ලැබියාව කිසිවකට පාවා දෙන ලෙසට අභ්‍යන්තර බලවේගයන්ගෙන් පීඩනයක් සිදු විය හැකිවද එවන් බලපෑම් වලට සියලු ආකාරයෙන් විරුද්ධ විය යුතුයි.